Hi everyone. One of the most famous places associated with King Arthur is Tintagel. Now, if you're not aware, Tintagel is a beautiful location in Cornwall where there are some ruins of a medieval castle. So it's a beautiful place. It can be a bit windy though, so be warned, but this isn't a travel vlog. The point is, this is one of the most famous locations associated with King Arthur, but is it really historically associated with him, or is this just a medieval invention? Where does this come from anyway? So let's take a look at the facts. There's actually good historical evidence that Arthur really may well have actually been associated with this place, but not in the way that most people think. So, according to the tradition, the famous tradition, King Arthur was supposedly born at Tintagel. Now this comes from the writings of Geoffrey of Monmouth. In about 1137 or thereabouts, Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote the Historia Regum Britanniae, which presented the first full account of Arthur's career, from birth to death. So according to Geoffrey, Arthur's father, Uther Pendragon, engaged in a war against Gorlois, the Duke of Cornwall, and Tintagel was one of his castles. So Tintagel is where Gorlois put his wife Igerna for safekeeping during this war with Uther Pendragon. But Uther Pendragon, using magic, was able to gain access to the castle, disguised as Gorlois, using Merlin's magic to disguise himself. So he gained access to the castle and he had relations with Igerna, pretending to be her husband. And that was how Arthur was conceived. And then that has led to the tradition that that was where Arthur was born. So we see in the earliest account it's where Arthur was conceived, and then eventually that's naturally led to this tradition that that was Arthur's birthplace, even though Geoffrey doesn't actually say that Arthur was born there. So that's the basic idea behind the connection between Arthur and Tintagel. It comes ultimately from Geoffrey of Monmouth's account of Arthur's conception. Now, obviously, there are lots of people who think that this has no historical basis whatsoever. It's historically worthless, so there's no evidence of any real connection between Tintagel and Arthur. So those are a few different ideas, but what are the facts? Well, there's good evidence that Geoffrey of Monmouth's account is actually historically accurate, at least in a broad sense. Now, the reason for saying this is because if we compare the account of the life of Uther Pendragon, the career of Uther Pendragon, with the records about the life of Tudrig, who was a historical king of South Wales, we find that there are a lot of strong similarities between the two of them. Now, Tudrig was the grandfather of a person called Athrois. Now, there's a lot of evidence that Athrois was actually the historical King Arthur. Now, regardless of whether you actually believe in this Athrois theory, the idea that Uther Pendragon could have been based on Tudrig is a theory that can stand on its own, that can exist in its own right, independent of the Athrois theory, although it does dovetail extremely well with the Athrois theory because Tudrig was Athrois' grandfather. But in any case, the point is, the records about the life of Tudrig tie in extremely well with the account of Uther Pendragon's career. And one example of this is the idea that he went on a military campaign in Cornwall. So in Geoffrey of Monmouth's account, it wasn't just the Cornish that Uther was fighting against, but it also mentions that Gorlois had reinforcements from Ireland. Now, in accounts about Tudrig's life, he is said to have fought in Cornwall against people coming from Ireland. And this takes place in about the year 500, which is also exactly when Geoffrey of Monmouth's account of Uther and his war against Gorlois is supposedly set. Now, in one of the accounts about the tradition about Tudrig fighting a war in Cornwall, it specifically says that he fought against the Duke of Tintagel, which ties in perfectly with what Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote about Uther and him fighting against Gorlois, who ruled over Tintagel. So that ties in perfectly. Now, these records about Tudrig are similar enough to the account about Uther that we can surmise that there must have been some connection between them. Logically, Tudrig was the origin of the figure of Uther Pendragon. However, the accounts are so dissimilar at the same time that Geoffrey clearly didn't just take the accounts about Tudrig and create the account about Uther Pendragon. They're clearly different enough that they're independent, but they're similar enough that they evidently had a common origin. So the point is that this supports the idea that the tradition of Uther or Tudrig fighting against a person who specifically ruled over Tintagel, may well be historical. So that means that the inclusion of Tintagel in this story probably isn't just an invention from Geoffrey of Monmouth, but it may well have a basis in the historical facts. And this is supported further by the fact that archaeology has shown that Tintagel was a very important place in the 6th century, in 6th century Britain. There's evidence of extensive pottery and other artifacts from the Mediterranean which had been brought there through trade, which shows that it was evidently a rich and important location. So there's good reason to believe that historically Tintagel may well have been involved in these events in 6th century Britain. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that Arthur was actually born there. Now here's the thing, if we accept that Tudrig was the historical Uther, then that would mean that the tradition about the conception of Arthur occurring at Tintagel being a result of this war between Uther and Gorlois, that's evidently not historical. Because Tudrig wasn't the father of Athrois, he was his grandfather. Tudrig was actually the father of Meirig, and we know for chronological reasons that Meirig had already been born about 20 years prior to this war with the Duke of Tintagel. So it is evident that Athrois was probably born at about the same time as when this war occurred. Athrois was probably born in about the year 500, or maybe a few years after that. And like I said, this war between Tudrig and the Duke of Tintagel evidently occurred around about the year 500. You can see my book for the detailed evidence for these dates. But the point is, they evidently happened at about the same time, this war and Athrois's birth. But they weren't actually connected. They don't seem to have been connected. Let's suppose that Tudrig really did take the wife of the Duke of Tintagel. Well, that's not really relevant because Meirig was the father of Athrois. It wasn't Tudrig who was the father of Athrois. So if we accept this scenario, then clearly Tintagel can't have been the place of the conception of Athrois, because Tudrig wasn't actually his father. However, that doesn't mean there's no connection at all, because actually I believe that Tudrig probably took the wife of the Duke of Tintagel after killing him and gave her to his son Meirig, and then Athrois was the result of that union. So I do think that Athrois's mother really was the wife of the Duke of Tintagel. However, I don't believe the conception really happened at Tintagel, because the marriage, it would have been the result of a marriage between Meirig and this wife, this woman, Igerna, if that really was her name. So that would have taken place after the war, probably in South Wales. So I don't think that has anything to do with Tintagel historically. However, that doesn't mean there's no historical connection between Arthur and Tintagel. In fact, there's very good evidence, there's very good reason to believe that Arthur was actually present at Tintagel. So the basis for this is, like I said, Tintagel, according to the archaeological evidence, was a very important place. It was a very rich location and a very prominent site in the kingdom of Dumnonia, which was the kingdom that ruled over Cornwall and Devon, and possibly even part of Dorset. So this ruled over a large portion of the West Country, and Tintagel appears to have been one of the most important locations in that area. Based on the archaeological evidence, lots of archaeologists believe that this was actually the seat of power of that kingdom, or one of the seats of power, because there's reason to believe that the kings of the early medieval period didn't have just a single seat of power, but they had various courts that they travelled between. So Tintagel may have been one of these seats of power, but in any case it appears to have been one of them, if not the only one. So if the kings of Dumnonia ruled from Tintagel, which does seem to have been the case, then there's good reason to believe that Arthur would have been present there. So what's the basis for saying that? Well, the reason is that there's very strong and consistent evidence from Welsh tradition, and actually non-Welsh sources as well for that matter, that Arthur was a close associate of the kings of Dumnonia. For example, there's an early Welsh poem which associates Arthur with Geraint. Geraint was the king of Dumnonia for a time in the 6th century, and then other records associate him with other kings of Dumnonia. For example, there's a medieval hagiography which connects Arthur with Caddo, the king of Dumnonia. He appears to have been the son of Geraint. And then in Geoffrey of Monmouth's account, we have Arthur abdicating in favour of Constantine, the son of Caddo or Cador. So we have this clear evidence of a strong connection between Arthur and the kings of Dumnonia. In fact, in that hagiography that I mentioned, Arthur isn't just shown as being an ally of Caddo, he's actually presented as ruling with him at a royal court in the West Country. So the connection between them was extremely strong, it was extremely close, as also evidenced by the fact that Arthur supposedly abdicated in favour of Constantine. So if Arthur was a close ally of the kings of Dumnonia, and according to at least one hagiography, he was with Caddo in one of his courts, then it's entirely plausible, it's probable in fact, that he visited the main royal courts of the kings of Dumnonia. And since Tintagel was one of these main royal courts according to archaeology, it's logical that Arthur would have visited Tintagel. It's entirely plausible, in fact it's probable, in my opinion, that Arthur was there. He went and visited the royal court just as they probably visited Arthur's royal court as well. And the same applies to various other allies of Arthur. They almost certainly visited each other's royal courts, they went on official visits, they would have brought gifts to each other and developed these dynastic ties, these diplomatic ties. So there's every reason to believe that since Arthur was, according to all accounts, a strong ally of the kings of Dumnonia, and since Tintagel appears to have been one of their main royal courts, Arthur logically would have visited. So this doesn't mean that this was Arthur's court, and it doesn't mean that this was where Arthur was conceived or born, but he almost certainly does have a historical connection to the place. He almost certainly was present there, at least on occasion. Now, if you'd like to know, does Plato's description of Atlantis really fit the Eye of the Sahara? Then come back next time for my next video.